we have a couple of empirical motivations for a paper. Well, this is actually the outline, so just done the introduction. The empirical motivation are some patterns that empiricists have argued hold regarding differences between democracies and dictatorships. And then the heart of what I'm going to talk about today from a modeling point of view will be a relatively simple extension of Condorcet's jury theorem, which will basically use in a context where people have unequal power. So the leader, for example, is more powerful than any of the other members of the governing coalition, and we'll examine the effects of that. Part 4 I'm not going to do today because that's really a topic that's more of interest to people in comparative politics, which has to do with the stability, the relative stability of democratic systems versus dictatorships, and similarly with point 5. Okay, so let me give you a couple of important empirical patterns. Now, I'm not an expert on any of these areas, so you know, if you have challenges to them, please don't wait. Raise your hand. My understanding of the literature, the empirical literature on economic growth and democracy is that there is no clear relation. No clear, compelling empirical regularity has been found. Some studies find a positive association, some studies find a negative association, some studies find no relation, but basically the consensus, the kind of informal meta-analysis in the literature is that there isn't a compelling relationship. That's regarding average growth rates, however. There is some indication, and I want to be pretty modest about the strength of the claim here. There is some indication that growth under democracies may be less volatile than growth under dictatorships. So essentially the variance of the growth rate is higher under dictatorships. Second kind of regularity, Amartya Sen's hypothesis that democracies very rarely have famines. Now this is not, by the way, this claim pertains to, and here of course the incentive issues are very prominent, this claim pertains to the home domains of democracies, that is where the voters are, not if there's an empire, not to the colonies. So for example, obviously Amartya Sen knew about the terrible famine in Bengal in the 1940s. This is not inconsistent with his hypothesis because that didn't take place in England, it took place in India, and the politicians in England weren't accountable to the people in Bengal. But even so, just restricted to the home domains of democracies, this is an interesting regularity. And the third one has to do with an extremely important non-economic area. In fact, if most of us were asked to pick the two most important policy domains of government, we'd probably pick guns and butter as economics and national security. And interestingly, since 1815, democracies have won more than 3/4 of the war in which they have participated. And this tendency, from our point of view, the second point is particularly interesting. That's especially true for wars that democracies start. So it seems that there is more care with regard to the starting of wars in democracies than in dictatorships. So when you put these three patterns together, or even suppose the first one doesn't hold up and there's no clear relationship between democracies and the second moment of the economic growth distribution, if you put any two of these together, so long as the third one doesn't go the other way, it's interesting. It's interesting because these are all important policy areas, famines, economic growth, and war. And so we want to take a look at the causes of these empirical regularities. And as I mentioned, the basic idea from bounded rationality that we're going to be working with is overconfidence. That leaders don't know how little they know. about a particular area. It's interesting when I teach a course, a first quarter required course for the MBAs in our business school that's called Critical and Analytical Thinking, or CAT for short. And one of the most important things in CAT is getting students to develop their metacognitive skills. In fact, if you look at the literature in ed psych and developmental psych, it turns out that metacognition is one of the most important, developing metacognitive skills is one of the most important things that can happen to a person during education. It's reflecting more. What do I really know? How well do I know it? Versus what do I believe? And so on and so forth. And so when I first mentioned to the MBAs in the class, I say, somebody doesn't know something, they merely think they know it, or even worse and more abstractly, you may not know something, but at least you may know that you don't know it. And people start to giggle in class when I say that. And the giggling I take as diagnostic of the fact that this is something interesting to people, to think about things in this way. This may not be something that comes naturally to us. And the evidence is, in fact, that metacognition isn't something that comes naturally to us. It's something that needs to be learned and developed. And if that's true, and if it's also true if the empirical pattern of overconfidence for leaders is also true, you've got a combination that can be somewhat dangerous. That somebody starts a policy without realizing how little they know. They stood up to the Japanese in World War II, and they had stood up to the most powerful military power in the world, the US, in the Korean War. You have a succession of experiences like that, it's not too surprising that you become quite confident. The only problem is, what does winning wars or standing up to superpowers in military matters teach you about economic policy? And the natural, sensible answer is essentially nothing. Essentially nothing. But they were nevertheless men of tremendous confidence. And they didn't realize how little they knew about economic policy. It wasn't just a policy that was socially inefficient and politically efficient. It was a bloody disaster in every sense of the word. Nothing that the governing coalition wanted came out. Steel was produced that was of such dreadful quality it had to be junked. Where did some of the steel come from? Agricultural tools used for harvest were melted down as input for the steel mill, the backyard steel mills. And where did the labor come from? Some of the best workers on the farms were then diverted. So the agricultural production went down, the real steel production barely went up. This was a bloody disaster. And I'll bet if we could have done studies of the leadership before the fact, the leadership, it would be revealed, was not doing a well-calculated gamble that ex post turned out badly. Ex ante, it was stupid. But they didn't realize how stupid it was. Okay. So that's sort of the basic framework.